Yes, I think it should be working now. Very good, very great. Let's just jump right into the agenda right away. So for us today, we have a little welcome introduction. We'll get to that in just a second. Then we will introduce the CSRD and the ESRS. Then we'll do a deep dive into the ESRS E1. And then we also have the presentation of our 5-step guide on how to get through with E1 implementation. And then lastly, we have prioritized 15 minutes to go through a Q&A session. Here we have both received some questions before the webinar today that we'll go through, and then we will open the floor for all of the questions in the chat and the questions from you. But before we jump into the content of the day, let's just introduce you and I, Maria, and maybe you would like to start.
Yes, thank you very much, Minna. I want to also say how great it is to see so many of you participating in the webinar today. So my name is Maria Steingrímsdóttir, and I am a manager here in our climate team at Nordic Sustainability. In the climate team, we work with greenhouse gas inventories, climate targets, and decarbonization roadmaps. And I have a background as an environmental engineer. And prior to joining Nordic a little more than a year ago, I was working for 5 years in an engineering consultancy. And then over the past 6 months, I've had the pleasure to dig really deep into the requirements of the ESRS E1 and get familiar with all of the elements that companies need to report on in regards to climate change information. And I really look forward to give you some insights into this complex topic here later on today.
Yes, thank you for that, Maria. And I am Minna Shukri. I will be your moderator of today. And here at Nordic Sustainability, I'm a senior consultant. I've been here for a year almost, working mainly with CSRD and ESRS. So I've done a lot of double materiality assessment and data gap assessments by now. My academic background is within sustainable design engineering. So also an engineer just like Maria. Prior to Nordic Sustainability, I was also a sustainability consultant in another consultancy firm. And prior to that, I was head of sustainability in a robotics company. So as probably a lot of you participating today, I know the struggle of sitting on the other side of a consultancy service and being part of the industry. So both Maria and I come from Nordic Sustainability, which is an impact-driven consultancy firm with an increased focus on sustainable transformation and strategy development. What we tend to say that really categorize us at Nordic Sustainability is that we are sustainability experts first, and then afterwards we are consultants. And we are all very much driven by always looking at science and evidence to create impact. On a starting note, let's just set the intention of today. So why is ESRS important and why do you need to start now? Well, first of all, ESRS E1 is a standard that is material for almost all companies that we've seen so far. Secondly, the ESRS is the standard that is the largest standard in terms of disclosure requirements, and further also the standard that entails most of the quantitative data points. And thirdly, since climate and everything related to climate has been an ongoing topic and something that most companies has worked with, is also one of the most mature topics under the ESRS, which then foster quite high expectations from both internal and external stakeholders. Further, from our own experience, we have noted that clients that get ahead a bit early on with this compliance will allow for a more in-depth analysis, which also leads to greater results and also results in a much less stressed organization. So we very much encourage to start early on. Let's just create a common ground. What is the CSRD and the ESRS? So the CSRD is one of the new directives coming from the EU, and it's a part of the European Green Deal, what we here at Nordic Sustainability call an unprecedented regulatory tsunami. It has the ambition of making Europe the first climate neutral continent in the world. And within the CSRD, we have the ESRS, which is a standardized framework of how to comply with this new directive. And you will be subjected, or companies will be subjected to the CSRD in 4 ways. and the maturity will also increase during the years. I'll talk a bit more about that a bit later. But all in general, it will first be all of the big companies above 500 people that will be subjected firstly. Then it will be what we call accounting class C that will be subjected, where you need to, in the second bracket here, you need to have at least 2 of the 3 criteria ticked off. And then we have listed SMEs, and then lastly, non-European companies with a turnover above 100 million euros. Great. Then we have, what is the purpose of the CSRD? Well, as I just mentioned, overall, it's a part of reaching net zero within Europe. But other than that, the CSRD also has the ambition of, first of all, redirect capital flow by increased focus of investment in sustainable activities. It's about addressing systemic risk, and also lastly about promoting a bit more long-term thinking. So typically within organizations, what we see right now is that we think 3, or at least we plan 3 to 5 years ahead on a strategic level, and also in terms of risk assessments. But with the CSRD, we are obliged to look beyond the 5 years to understand the total societal and environmental impacts that we might have. So next slide, please. Yes. So further, we are here at Nordic Sustainability has detected 5 new elements from the ESRS that will be enforced into sustainability reporting. First of all, it will be mandatory to conduct a double materiality assessment. The next one up is that you have to account the totality of your value chain. This both includes material flow, but also the stakeholders within your value chain. Then you have to link all of the material topics to your business model and your strategy. And then we have step number 4, which is really a key element. It's about transparency, and the CSRD is really pushing for more transparent reporting. And lastly, it will require a big expansion of the current data availability for almost all European companies. So this might seem like a lot, but it is important to stress already now that there is no indications whatsoever in the CSRD yet that you have to have everything under control by year 1. What we see and experience as best practice from the industry is to develop an implementation plan, an action plan for all material topics to reach compliance. And then it's very much allowed to then gradually mature within the next coming years. And that's here where transparency becomes key. Just be transparent on where you are on the journey, what you have data on, and what you are already doing. And at the same time, it's just as important to be very clear about where you are lacking data and what your plan is for reaching reasonable assurance and a stronger data foundation for the future. Great. Now on to what is the ESRS. So the ESRS consists of 4 building blocks. It's metrics and targets, it's IRO management, it's strategy, and governance. All of these 4 building blocks will be a part of informing your business model and strategies going forward. And the ESRS, as you probably already know by now, consists of 12 standards, where we have 2 of them, that's the cross-cutting standards, and then we have 10 topical standards, and then we have some sector-specific standards, but we will not go into these in today's session. What we have experienced so far whenever you work with these standards and the different building blocks is that the first time you have to do this exercise, it can become really comprehensive and it can seem like a lot. But we've also seen that when you replicate this work, it becomes way more easier because they are all built with the same 4 building blocks. So gather yourself with patience. It will become less complex the more you do it. So for today's session, we will only focus on one topical standard. It will be ESRS E1, climate change. And this standard entails climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and energy. And this is where Maria will take us a bit more through.
Thank you, Minna, for this really good introduction to the ESRS. I will now focus on ESRS E1 and what that standard entails. So climate change will be material for almost all companies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So climate change will be material for most companies, but what are the consequences of that? We will get to that. So the ESRS E1 standard is in fact the only topical standard where if you decide that it is not material, you will need to explain in detail why you have taken that decision. So most likely the double materiality will result in climate change being material, and the consequence of that is that the company will need to publicly report on climate change information in accordance to ESRS E1. And this reporting needs to be made available for stakeholders and investors. But how do you do it? You need to follow the disclosure requirements in the ESRS E1 standard. And the ESRS E1 standard is divided into 9 disclosure requirements that are presented here on the slide. So the first one is a transition plan for climate change mitigation. The second one is on climate policies, and the third one on actions and resources. You can see there is a slight difference in the coloring of the disclosure requirements, and this is to highlight that these disclosure requirements are embedded within different building blocks of the ESRS, which Minna showed you before. The transition plan is embedded within the strategy, as this disclosure point outlines the strategy for how the company is going to decarbonize. Then climate policies and actions and resources are embedded within the IRO management, which is how the company manages its impacts, risks, and opportunities related to climate change. The other 6 disclosure requirements are located within metrics and targets and mainly consist of quantitative data points. These are climate targets, energy consumption and mix, greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas removals and greenhouse gas mitigation projects, internal carbon pricing, and the last 2 I mentioned here, so E17 and E18, are not something that is required for companies to do by the ESRS, but if you have either greenhouse gas removals or greenhouse gas mitigation projects or internal carbon pricing scheme, you need to report on it according to the ESRS. And then the last disclosure requirement is financial effects from risks and opportunities. So under these disclosure requirements that I presented here before, there are a number of data points. And if we look deeper into these, there are in total 220 data points within the ESRS E1. And the ESRS E1 is the standard with the largest amount of data points. There are different topics that can be deemed material within the climate change standard. And these are climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, energy, and then there's a good amount of data points that are cross-cutting that need to be reported on for all material topics. So for a few companies, maybe only 1 or 2 of these will be material, and therefore only triggering a reporting requirement on data points belonging to these. However, the majority of companies will need to report on all climate change material topics, including all 220 data points. And in our experience doing a lot of double materiality assessment, we see that climate change is material for almost every company. And if we look a little bit into how the data points are divided, there are 132 that are quantitative, so most of them are quantitative. And then there are 88 that are qualitative, meaning text descriptions, etc. So I know that this seems like a lot to report on 220 data points. So how do you get started with ESRS E1 reporting? And here we have provided a little practical guide towards the first ESRS reporting. We know that probably many of you listening in today are now conducting the double materiality assessment or just finished with it. And then the next step is to do a data gap assessment, where you look through the required data points and create an overview of the data gaps that your company has in order to be able to gather and report according to the ESRS E1. In our experience with data gap assessment, climate is generally the standard where companies are most mature, so have the most amount of data. But we have also experienced some companies that currently only have a fraction of the data required for ESRS E1. So once you have completed the data gap assessment and you have this overview, then you need to agree on the scope and ambition level. Are you only doing the minimum to be compliant, or do you actually want to use this opportunity here to set an ambitious climate strategy and to meet stakeholder expectation and anchor climate action within the organization? And we, of course, recommend you to do the latter. So once you have this clear ambition, you arrive at the part of covering the data gaps that your company has. And this is where the company needs to conduct projects or tasks in order to be able to report on the required data points. And the size of this task will depend on where your company currently is with climate reporting. Many companies are quite far already and others haven't started. And then also, of course, on the ambitions of the company. But completing the desired data gaps can take a considerable amount of time. So get started sooner rather than later, we always say. Once you then have completed these projects and gathered the necessary data, you are ready to report according to ESRS E1. And as Minna showed before, the waves that the companies are subject to ESRS, the first wave of CSRD are required to report in 2025 based on 2024 data. And therefore, for these companies, time is of the essence to get started on covering the data points. But also, as Minna mentioned, it's not a requirement or expected that every company has a full list of data points by year one. It's about maturing over time. And now I will dive deeper into the third step of covering the data. So what projects does a company need to conduct in order to do ESRS E1 reporting? And how does the road to ESRS E1 implementation look like? We have completed this 5-step guide here. And through this 5-step guide, you will be able to deliver on future reporting requirements and meet your stakeholders' expectations. And the first one here is that companies need to perform a complete greenhouse gas inventory. So understanding where their emissions come from. Then you also need to understand the risks and opportunities that are related to climate change on your company. Then you need to build policies around climate change mitigation and adaptation, set climate targets, and last but most importantly, companies should develop a transition plan for how to decarbonize their business. Many companies will already have completed some or many of these boxes here, and then it's about making sure that the way you have done it answers the necessary data points that are required by the ESRS, while other companies are just at the starting point. And for them, we recommend starting with the first one here and going through all of these 5 steps. And now I will go deeper into each of these 5 steps, starting with the greenhouse gas inventory. So the first step here is about understanding your emission sources, and that is, of course, the foundation to any climate action. You need to understand where your emissions come from in order to be able to do something about them. And therefore, of course, the first step is to create a comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory where you calculate CO2 emissions from the company's activity. The inventory needs to cover all 3 scopes described in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol framework and include all emissions that are under a company's operational control. These emissions include Scope 1 emissions, which are direct emissions, Scope 2 emissions from purchased energy, and Scope 3 emissions, which are all other emissions coming from up and downstream value chain of the company. Creating a full greenhouse gas inventory can be a really resource-heavy task for companies, as you need to collect a lot of data on all of the business activities that lead to emissions. And in our experience, most companies in scope for CSRD have completed at least their Scope 1 and 2 inventories, but there are many companies still figuring out how to do a comprehensive Scope 3 inventory. And that is especially if you want to be able to catch activity data rather than spend-based data, and thereby set the direction for your company's decarbonization plan. And on top of reporting Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, companies also need to provide information on the greenhouse gas intensity, meaning the total greenhouse gases per net revenue. And this will enable investors and stakeholders to compare companies. Then you also need to provide a detailed overview of the energy consumption and mix. And then you need to report if you have Scope 1 emissions under regulated trading schemes. And it's also important here to say that the emissions that you report under ESRS E1 cannot include any greenhouse gas removals, storage, or carbon credits. All right, then let's hop into the second step here, which is about climate risks and opportunities. And this is one of the steps where ESRS reporting requirements are very new to a lot of companies. We experienced that this is something that not a lot of companies are familiar with yet. So we will give you the highlights here, and then please ask if you have any more questions. But why do you need to do this? Apart from it being, of course, a requirement in the ESRS E1, it will bring your company in a better position to manage the challenges and opportunities that arise from climate change, based on different projections and scenarios for global warming in both near and far future. But what do you actually need to do? You need to assess the financial effects that your company might experience from material physical risks, and these are divided into acute and chronic risks. And then just to give you some examples here, because this is a little bit theoretical, this could be, for example, damage on assets from flooding or increased costs from water shortage. Then you also need to assess the financial effects from material transitional risks. So because the society is transitioning to a more low carbon society, how does that affect your company? And here you need to again look into a short, medium, and long term. And these can be, for example, increased cost for the company due to carbon taxes, or profit losses from changes in consumer behavior. The third point that you need to report on here is to assess potential climate-related opportunities. So any cost savings that climate change mitigation and adaptations actions can have on the company. And this could be, for example, increased profit from new low carbon technology. But what tools and frameworks can you use to do these assessments? There were some of you that asked about this in the survey that we sent out before the webinar. And even though the TCFD has ceased to exist, it still provides a really good framework for climate risk assessment. But also in the application requirements in the ESRS E1 standard. So at the bottom of the standard, there is a pretty good explanation of what is expected from you. So I would recommend you to start there and then look into the TCFD framework. And in terms of the climate scenario analysis, which is sort of the background to these risk assessments, there you can use the IPCC scenarios and projections that are presented in the IPCC reports. And now we have arrived at the third step here, which is around building climate policies. So, what are you being asked here? You are being asked to report on how your policies address material impacts, risks, and opportunities related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. The implementation of strong policies will help to build incentives and drive decarbonization within the company. The ESRS provides no specification to what the policies need to include, and it does not have to be a separate climate policy, as climate-related matters can be included in different policies that may already exist in the company. These are, for example, travel policy, procurement policy, training policy, investment policy, supply chain policies, just to name a few. And our clear recommendation is to include climate-related matters into already existing policies. In this way, your employees will work more closely with the policies, and thereby the policies will be more effective. But what does a good policy look like? It is short, it is signed by management, it states the long-term commitment that a company has, it is publicly available and reviewed annually. So now we're at the fourth step here, which is around setting climate targets. Setting clear climate targets will put pressure on and engage companies to take action on climate matters. Companies should set climate targets for 2030 and, if applicable, also for 2050. Sorry. And companies need to explain what was the framework and methodology used for setting those targets. The disclosure requirement under targets also requires reporting of the expected decarbonization levers that a company has to meet the targets. Intensity targets, meaning targets that are set not in absolute values of CO2 or in percentage of CO2, but in, for example, CO2 per revenue. These kinds of targets are allowed within the ESRS E1. But if you have these targets, you need to also report on the absolute values for the target year to make this very clear to stakeholders and investors. If your company already has set science-based targets, then you are very well set up for reporting on the data points related to targets. And there are definitely a lot of benefits to draw from having validated SBTi targets. It will, for example, make the explanation of the framework and methodology behind the targets, and also how the targets are compatible with the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, much more easier as it is an external, very scientifically known standard. But just some useful information for the companies that already have validated SBTi targets. The targets in the ESRS E1 need to be set for 2030. But currently, it is possible to set near-term targets through the SBTi framework between 2028 and 2033. So there might be some recalculations that you need to do before being able to report according to ESRS E1, because you need to then recalculate your target to 2030. And now we have reached the last step, but what I think is clearly the most important step on this journey, and this is the development of the transition plan. The climate transition plan ties in a lot of the before mentioned data points, such as the greenhouse gas emissions and climate targets. So if you and your company already have a transition plan, you're very well prepared for ESRS E1 reporting. A climate transition plan outlines a company's plan to decarbonize, describing the pathways and milestones needed to achieve the climate target set. And in my experience, this is the most comprehensive disclosure requirement, the one that takes the longest time to conduct, and the one that requires the biggest amount of stakeholders and funding from the company. But how does a process for creating such a transition plan look like? I would recommend with starting out with creating an overview of the emission hotspot, and then to identify applicable decarbonization levers and initiatives to reduce these emissions. The next step is then to calculate the emission reduction potential of each initiative, as you can see displayed in the figure, and also to calculate the financial impacts to implement these decarbonization initiatives. Lastly, you need to prioritize these initiatives and also create an implementation plan for the transition plan. So as you can see, this is a very big task, and because the transition plan looks long-term towards how you're going to decarbonize, you also need to make these shorter term implementation plans. But apart from having to explain the decarbonization levers and the key actions planned in the ESRS E1, you also need to report on other data points. And these are, for example, the investments and funds that the company has put into the transition plan. And here, the internal carbon pricing scheme that I mentioned as one of the disclosure requirement points can be an impactful way of funding the climate transition plan, and something that we recommend companies to look into. Then you also need to report on how the transition plan is embedded within the business strategy and financial planning, if the transition plan is approved and signed off by management, and how the transition plan is aligned with the EU taxonomy. So now we are through all of the 5 steps, and I know that this was a lot of information. So I will just do a short recap of my session here. So a robust ESRS E1 reporting should answer these following questions. What current impacts on climate change does the company have? Here you need to look into the greenhouse gas inventory and energy overview. What target has the company set to mitigate those impacts? Here we're talking about the climate targets. How is the company going to mitigate these impacts and adapt? Here we are talking about the strategy to decarbonize, so transition plan, actions and resources and policies. And then what physical and transitional risks related to climate change does the company foresee? This is embedded within the climate risk assessment. And finally, does the company foresee any climate-related opportunities? And here you look into the assessment of opportunities. Thank you so much for listening in. I will now hand over back to Minna to do the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Maria, and what a great introduction to the ESRS E1 and also our step guide. Let's move into some of the questions. So we're going to start off with some questions that we got before, and now just feel free to add some questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. I've seen you already started on that. But let me start with the first question that we have selected for today's Q&A. And it is about SMEs and how SMEs should tackle the CSRD, ESRS, and how also to go beyond as an SME. And I think I'll just try to start, and then Maria, feel free to add in here. But there's, of course, 2 options for SMEs in Europe. So there is the ones that are subjected to CSRD, the listed SMEs. And for those, we recommend, of course, following the guidelines presented here, but also following the guidelines from EFRAG. And then if you're not subjected to the CSRD, but you want to work with it anyways, then we definitely recommend looking into the voluntary standard that has been developed by EFRAG. So look into that. And then the great part of this question, what if you want to go beyond? What if you want to go beyond simply sustainability reporting? Well, we have done a short little brainstorm session on that, a brainstorm session on that internally. And we definitely think that one of the things you and SME can do is to map out your customers firstly, and then figuring out which of these customers, your customers, will be subjected to the CSRD. And then try to see if you can go ahead of your customers and try to reach out to them proactively. Let them know that they are subjected to the CSRD. Let them know about your own level of maturity by now, and let them know how you plan to gradually mature. This will, first of all, reduce any stress internally in your organization, and also the urgency feeling of complying, which typically can be a bit reactive sometimes. And also when you are the one reaching out, you are clearly presenting that you're ready, and you want to also be a priority partner to this both customer, but maybe also even your suppliers. Yes, let's try to see one of the other questions that we have here. We got a very interesting question regarding the EU taxonomy and the link between E1 disclosure requirements, and also if anything can be reused. So Maria, maybe you would like to try and go ahead on what the link is between E1 and the EU taxonomy?
Yes, thank you for the question. There are definitely some links between the two, where the data from the EU taxonomy can be reused for ESRS E1 reporting. But there is a major difference also between these two regulations. So the ESRS in whole looks at the company level, so all reporting is to be done on a company level, whereas the EU taxonomy looks much more at an activity level. However, there are some links, for example, in the disclosure requirements on actions and resources. You need to report on CAPEX and OPEX costs for implementing some of the decarbonization actions that you have identified. And these you could derive directly from the EU taxonomy. And also within the transition plan, as I mentioned here lastly, you also need to describe there how the transition plan is aligned with the EU taxonomy. So there are some links, and that's mainly with where you have calculated these CAPEX and OPEX costs within the EU taxonomy that you can then reuse in the ESRS E1 reporting. But be aware of these differences, that one is on a company level, whereas the other is on a activity level.
Great, thank you so much, Maria, for that answer. So we have a question here. Let's just see, there is so many. That's so great. So we have another question maybe that also falls a bit into you here, Maria. Actually, the first one from the Q&A. How does the structure into the 9 building blocks, the one we have defined for ESRS E1, overlap with the potential material topics? So I mean, that must be related to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and energy.
Yes, so then if you have only one of these 4 potential material topics being material, then there will definitely be some of the 9 disclosure requirements that will not be necessary for you to report on. For example, if it's energy, then of course the disclosure requirement regarding energy consumption and mix and greenhouse gas emissions will be relevant for you, but then loads of the others will not. And then there is 1/4 of the data points are cross-cutting, meaning that you always need to report on those regarding if there's only one of these that are material or all 3. I hope that answered the question.
Amazing. Thank you, Maria. And then we have a question here also in the Q&A section, how to develop IROs based on integrated assessment models so that they not only serve reporting, but also gives a more realistic picture of a company. And I think maybe I can try to go ahead with that one. Okay, so great question. First of all, thank you so much. So here we definitely recommend starting off with doing the double materiality assessment, right, to figure out and define what is your company's most material IROs. And then afterwards, it is actually a part of the CSRD and ESRS to comply here, also to integrate this into your strategy, not only sustainability strategy, but your strategy, and also link it up against your business model. So this is how we would recommend also doing it, and then integrating it into your company, and also working with the governance element of ESRS to really anchor it in your organization. Okay, great. I hope that answers the question. And let's take maybe one more question, and then I think that will be it. I will get back to all of the questions we didn't manage to answer now, and then I'll get back to you on how we're going to meet some of those. But we have one here from Charlotte. Hello, what is the purpose of setting targets for 2030 for companies that will have to start reporting on CSRD only from 2028? Is this not a waste of time and efforts for such a short period of time? I think this is a really great question. And maybe Maria, you would like to shed some light upon this?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the purpose of setting so near-term targets is to really accelerate the climate transition and to accelerate your climate actions, because the more you reduce of emissions to start with, the better it is for the whole world. But then you actually need to, after 2030, you need to reassess your targets or reset your targets for every 5th year. So next time you will have targets for 2035, etc.
Great, thank you so much. I hope that answered the question. So now we are actually rounding off slowly because we have 1 minute left, but we just want to say on behalf of Maria and I, thank you so much for participating. Thank you for all of the great questions, and also thank you for hanging in for so long. It's been a pleasure from our side. And just in terms of these questions, so you were sending a lot of questions. That's super great. We will get back to those either in the chat here after the webinar, or we will try to reach out to you through your email if you're not anonymous, and then answer your questions there. So we will get back to you. And also in terms of the material from this session, we have recorded it, and we will share the recording with all of the participants from this webinar. Other than that, just before I send you off for the rest of your day, I really hope that you found this session useful and you had some great learnings. Feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. We have a lot of activity in here. And also please do go sign up on our newsletter. Then you can stay up to date. And if you have any questions regarding this step guide, or also just in general on CSRD and ESRS and how to get started, then feel free to reach out. I think that was all. Have a lovely rest of your day, and we hope to talk to you soon, everyone. Thank you so much for participating.